My name's Jackie Bailey, and I'm the moderator of today's panel, title being Mere Mortals. I acknowledge that we are meeting together today on the traditional lands of the Darkinjung people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I personally come from the traditional lands of the Wadi Wadi people of the Dharawal Nation, which is Wollongong, so the other side of Sydney. These guys are all from Sydney. Don't hold it against them. Not everyone can live in beautiful coastal towns.
From Queensland officially, but yeah, I defected, so yeah, I just want to make that clear at the outset.
Look, I'm also originally from Queensland, so we will be on the same side when it comes to state of origin, Lech. So we can still be friends. We can still be friends. All right, so I'm just going to introduce these amazing characters, but they all have bios as long as my arm, so I'll keep it fairly succinct, but know that for each accolade I read out, there's 10 or 20 more. So Lech Blaine, here on my left, is an author and an essayist and a political commentator. He's the author of this excellent memoir called Car Crash, a memoir. It's obviously available from the Bookface crew out there in the foyer. I heartily recommend it. On my right, I have Rachel and Ross Menzies. Rachel is a postgraduate fellow at the University of Sydney, and she specialises in the area of death anxiety. And Ross Menzies is the president of the 8th World Congress of Behavioural and Cognitive Therapies. Hopefully that's right. And founding director of the newly formed World Confederation of Cognitive and Behavioural Therapies. And Rachel and Ross wrote this book together. They travel the world together to various conferences, and they still have Christmas dinner together, presumably. So it's an achievement right there in and of itself. And yes, my name's Jackie Bailey. I'm the author of this book, the Eulogy, the yellow book, which just came out a few days ago. And I'm an interfaith minister and independent funeral director, which is maybe that's why they thought I'd be a bit interested in this topic. Who knows? So we will have time for questions at the end of this session, but I, of course, have many that will get us started. But I was hoping to start with you guys, Rachel and Ross, if that's okay, because I think it'll be really great for Rachel and Ross to set the scene a little bit with their research. So their book, Mortals, How the Fear of Death Shaped Human Society, also available from the bookstore, is an incredible journey through not just the psychological research, but also different strands of philosophy and literature about how our fear of death has perhaps shaped our behaviours, not always in rational ways. Reasonable, but maybe not rational. So you guys, would one of you like to read a little bit from your book to just give us a sense of where you're coming from?
Sure. So we thought we'd just read you a brief section of the opening today. So this is from the first chapter, which is titled Awakening to Death. I'll need my glasses. To have gazed at the stars of the Milky Way and yet to die. To have smiled at the face of your newborn child and still to die. To have touched another, loved deeply, and been loved in return, and even so to die. Life can feel so dazzling, so animated, so painfully vibrant that death seems impossible. From the moment we are born, we will live our days with only one consciousness, never really experiencing the inner world of another person. It is this inner sensory experience that we come to know and cherish. Our overpowering sensate nature that will make us feel remarkable. We will pass people on the streets, in our homes, schools, and places of work, and we will accept their existence, but it will always be in a somewhat detached manner. As the French existentialist taught us, we will always remain isolated from these other selves. An uncrossable bridge will lie between us and all others. We are destined to grow up overwhelmed by our own private world, an inner realm that will convince us that we are different from all others and that our lives will obey different rules from those of the masses. Death occurs, of course it does, but surely it happens to other people. It happens to strangers in foreign lands, to our neighbours, the ageing widow down the road, the sick child at number 26, perhaps even to our parents and grandparents, but not to us. And yet, at some level, we all suspect the truth from a very early age. Death is a universal that applies to all living things on earth, and so shockingly, it must logically apply to us. Despite the adoration we have for our inner sensory world, in the end, death will come for us. We are, as Shakespeare suggests, the protagonist in our own play, in our own theatre, who struts and frets his hour upon the stage. But the Grim Reaper watches from the dress circle and may rise to tread the boards with us at any moment. And when he joins us on our stage, like billions before us, we must bid the audience farewell. At that time, Macbeth's couplet is completed, and then we will be heard of no more. How do humans cope with the spectre of death overhanging all that they do? Distraction, denial, engaging in immortality projects to leave their mark on the planet? We do all of the above and much, much more.
Death will come for us all. It's like a line straight out of Game of Thrones, isn't it? It's also very true, though, right? And it's probably why shows like Game of Thrones are so popular. So what would be really great, I reckon, and I'm looking at my phone not because I'm checking my Twitter feed, but because I've got all my questions here just in case. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a bit of an outline of what you describe as the terror management theory. That you talk about a bit in the book. So just what does it mean, really, and what does it mean for how we view and deal with death?
Okay, so terror management theory is the dominant theory in psychology that explains the way that humans deal with death. And it comes down to the fact that we're a unique species. By the age of between 3 and 10 years of age, we acquire our understanding of death. By the age of 9 or 10, humans have a mature understanding of death. They know that death occurs to all living things. They know that you don't just pop up out of the grave and keep walking around. They know that bodily systems have shut down. And unfortunately, humans have this tremendous capacity to go forward in time, better than any other species. That's why we problem solve so well. So by that age, by the age of 9, we know ultimately we are going to face the grave. Terror management theory says that the rest of our life is spent trying to grapple with that. That the rest of life is a human trying to come to grips with death and trying to deal with the death crisis. And there are a few common strategies that it suggests we use. One is complete denial, religious belief scattered across our history from ancient Egypt to modern times. Terror management theory argues is a sense of denial. That is, I'll gain immortality. I don't believe death is an end, and that's the way I deal with it. And the other way that humans tend to deal with it is by living large according to their culture and their cultural values. If I live a very successful life according to the rules of my culture, I live a grand life, a memorable life, then I'll be talked about after my death, and I get a sort of symbolic immortality. I manage to achieve existence beyond the grave because I'm remembered for the things I did in my life. That could be through legacies, through projects, through the passing on of my surname. There's some of the ways we might be remembered. Obviously, by bearing children, I cheat death. By having large families, we have a population crisis on planet Earth. And part of the reason we have a population crisis is the human desire to continue their lineage. We know that from laboratory research that we cover in the book. You know, every time I have a child, I pass on half of my DNA. I continue to exist. Rachel is the firstborn of 4 that I've had. I've cheated death 4 times that way, and contributed to the crisis on the planet. So that's essentially what the theory is saying. That unconsciously, much of your activity in life is trying to deal with death, unconsciously. You won't be aware that death is the driver of so many of these things, but the laboratory research suggests strongly that it is.
This book is just jam-packed with examples of that. because I don't know about if any of you have read it yet, but you read that kind of bristling. Oh, I don't live like that. My life is not an immortality project. And then you think about, your house and your daughter and, even just the clothes you wear and the photos you take and the Instagram account you fail to maintain and all of that sort of stuff. You think, well, okay, maybe Rachel and Ross might have something, them and all their research. So what I would like to know, Rachel and Ross, is just at the personal level, what kind of approach, as a result of all of your research, has that changed your approach to death? Now that you know from all of the scientific evidence that you yourselves have gathered, has that changed the way you think about, well, not just death, but life, I suppose? In your book, you talk about various practices, that Buddhists use to visualize death so that they become more comfortable with it, I suppose. Or you also talk about I think it was a Swiss or a French guy or someone who started the death cafe movement. Do you sit around the dinner table and talk about death?
Yes, we do. Surprise, surprise. Yeah, definitely. So there's growing research that shows that the key to overcoming fears of death is starting to face reminders of it. So far, all the evidence suggests that the most effective way, if we're fearful of death, is to actually surround ourselves with reminders of it. So spending time in cemeteries or spending time contemplating your own death, watching movies about death, that this seems to be the most effective way to start actually cultivating acceptance of death. So there's research that's come out in the last 5 or so years showing that, but this is not a particularly new idea. This is something that Buddhists have known for a long time, something that the Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome have known for a long time. Seneca, the famous Stoic philosopher, said, "Study death always so that you fear it never." So this is an ancient idea that is just now having the scientific backing for it. So because of the work we do, not just with research, but also as clinical psychologists, talking a lot about death to people, that becomes a bit of that exposure of facing death. But we do all kinds of things. We play, you can buy games that are death-positive conversation games. There's one that happens to be called Mortals. We've played that. We've played that with my youngest brother, Jude, who would have been about 9, where we all sit around asking these questions about, would you like to be buried or cremated? And what songs would you like played at your funeral? Dad, do you want to talk about your desk?
Well, I've got a project at the moment that might sound a bit morbid, but I'm very excited about it. I'm getting a desk made for my office that will be my coffin. The desk will dismantle and reassemble into the coffin that I plan to be, at this stage, cremated in. As a permanent reminder. My wife also suggests that it's a reminder of how tied to that desk I am, and that I should die near it. But living with reminders of your impermanence is an important part of this. I have skulls in my office and images of paintings of skeletons and so on. Because that very much is the ancient idea. Surround yourself with this so that you're not fearful of it, that you're well aware of it, you're well aware of the fact that you'll pass, and doing things every day to bring that home. I like to touch, something you could do right now if you wanted to, I like to, a couple of times a day, just touch the eye sockets. The eye sockets on the human skull are very marked. You can feel your hand running in and around them and under the eye socket. And I do that once or twice a day to remind myself that there is a skeleton in there, and the skin is thinning. I'm getting older, and right now I have musculature that can move the skeleton around. It's really cool. I could get in a car and I could drive up here and look at this magnificent beach, and I can take the skeleton to cafes and restaurants, but not for long. Not for long. Soon enough, I'll join the 107 billion people that have died before me. I like to remind myself that in the living years, I'd like to do a lot of fun stuff while I can still move the skeleton. So reminders of death are a really important part of this.
There you go. Some tips for a rainy day at home. Move that skeleton around. No, thanks, Ross. That's super interesting. And I mean, I laugh because it's very familiar. We talk, of course we talk about death, because of the work that I do.
Yeah.
And my daughter is 10. She's very, very comfortable talking about death and, wanting to become part of the grass and all of that sort of stuff. And I do have to explain to her she won't necessarily know that she's part of the grass. And she's like, all right, well, it'll still be cool. Can we turn to you now, bring you into this conversation? I was just going to ask you, if you don't mind, to read us a little bit from your book, Car Crash. So Lech's book, Car Crash, is a memoir of, well, the clue is in the title, of a car crash that he was part of as a younger man, in which a number of his friends did die or were permanently disabled. And so Lech has, come up very, very close to death and, of course, the fear of death and what happens after death, like in life. Yeah.
Okay. The 1-year anniversary of the car crash caught me by surprise. I didn't have the 2nd of May circled in my diary or set as a reminder on my iPhone. It was on the Sunday of that ominous Labor Day long weekend. I knew dimly about memorial events planned in Toowoomba. I cited assignment deadlines and unmissable shifts as a reason to not go home. On Saturday night, the steep streets were darkened by overhanging fruit trees. On evenings like this, I bitterly contemplated sleep, not as a genuine prospect, but more like an unfeasible overseas holiday. The only way to untwist my corkscrew thoughts was to keep accelerating. Alongside the river, I hit a peak in the bend at high speed, headlights ignited across the unlit bitumen. I didn't collide with the vehicle opposite, but I couldn't say with conviction that was a positive thing. The narrator provided directions to the next address. At the roundabout, take the second exit. You have arrived at your destination. The place had a rendered fence and sensor lights, and an intercom with a little camera. The customer answered the door as if he wasn't expecting me. Polo shirt and cologne, 50s by the fistful. I was a pizza delivery driver, if you didn't realise. Hey champ, he said, busy night or what? Yep, I said, makes the time go quicker. That's the spirit, what's the damage? My dissociation had found a potential benefactor. I recited his order with premeditated glee. He grimaced. I tell you what, you don't bloody miss, do ya? I grinned at him. The man gave me 2 50s. Then he handed back a 20 from the change. Buy yourself a 6-pack. Thanks, mate, I said. Have a good one. The hardest part of the shift was finishing. There was nowhere left to go except an empty apartment because my sister and her boyfriend were back in Toowoomba for the long weekend, along with most of my friends. Tonight, the eve of the anniversary, Facebook filled with people confessing deep grief over the loss of Will, Hamish and Henry. Rest in peace, they wrote. I thumbed through the condolences and the cheerful photos of the grievers who posted them. Their secret was the same as mine. A subterranean pain lurked below our curated profiles. When I ran out of mourners to stalk, I moved on to the mourn. Unlike in a cemetery, I could see the bodies of the dead and spot new pictures that they were missing from. I searched my name on Google and consumed the old newspaper articles, fingering through the outrage and conspiracy theories in the comment threads. I pressed my fingers against the pixels and kept scrolling and staring and scrolling and staring. Will, Hamish and Henry were dead. I felt like a psychopath, ashamed that I could eat breakfast, brush my teeth, and smile at strangers on public transport. Meanwhile, my friends were gone and their families broken. How was I capable of thinking about anything else? It was 4 a.m. I slid the door open to the balcony. Finance had colonised the skyline. Banks paid vast sums to plaster the city with elegant logos so that we'd dream about their life insurance plans. A survivor was stuck outside of time, always plummeting back towards the lone event that mattered. I felt guilt about happiness, guilt about sadness, guilt about feeling guilt, guilt about not feeling guilt. There was never any happy or unhappy medium. I either felt too messed up or not messed up enough.
Thanks, Lech. I've got a bunch of questions for you, but I guess following on from what I was asking Rachel and Ross, given your experiences with death, is death something that you nowadays that you feel kind of comfortable talking about? Like, do you think about your own, how you want to go?
Yeah, I feel reasonably comfortable talking about it. So a couple of years after the accident, my dad passed away, and then 7 years after that, my mum passed away. So I was like quite young to have confronted a pretty significant series of tragedies and mourning processes. And growing up, I was the youngest of 6 siblings, and I was my parents' only biological child. And I think I hadn't met my grandparents because my parents were quite old, and my dad had heart attacks when I was quite young, and so I confronted mortality even before the accident. I confronted it quite an early age, and I also, Dad was pretty. He sort of thought that he was going to die pretty young. He used to joke about it quite darkly, and so he had this biological son, and he named me after Lech Blaine, and he was very much obsessed with his legacy, and so he bought all these pubs, and he'd buy racehorses, and he'd buy rental properties, and but yeah, he was always fairly grimly humorous about the fact that that he was going to kick the bucket one day, in his sort of words. So when I was younger, I grew up in a pub, so I didn't come from a remotely religious family, and Dad was an atheist. Mum wasn't particularly religious, and I think that all of that fed into me at a young age. I developed this weirdly religious streak. I used to pray at night, and I'd pray that my dad, that if he died, that he would go to heaven, and that because I was, I think he was 5 when he had his first major heart attack, and so I was, and he used to say to me, I'd say, what happens if you die? And he'd say, nothing, not much. And so I was very much trying to find a way to, that I would be able to maintain contact with him if he was to die. Obviously, that didn't happen until I was 19. Now he's passed away. My mum's passed away. I've confronted death continuously, and I don't think about it in a particularly grim way. I think about my parents every day. I don't necessarily, not always necessarily in a completely melancholy way. I just love thinking about them. I feel pretty connected to them. I feel the work that I do now, in a weird way, sort of fuses them together. So my mum was a really big reader, and she loved writing. My dad had never read a book, but he loved politics, and so I'm able to consummate these obsessions that they both had, and that feels like my way of honouring them. Even if I'm not consciously thinking of that all the time, but I don't believe in an afterlife, so I'm not. Even though I'm not I'm not terrified of death, but I'm also not. I also don't really care what happens after I die. I don't have much of a supernatural streak, so I'm sort of well, that's for other people to worry about. So I'll be gone. I won't really have much to worry about. So yeah, I haven't got any major expectations, and yeah, as I said, I'm not. Even though I've seen death a lot, I'm not terrified of it. My main fear is suffering. My mum died over a long period of time, and so I'm terrified of drifting away over a long period and losing my faculties. But I'm not actually scared of death. If you were to tell me, and this will sound really grim, but if you were to tell me, you've got until the age of 50, and then on your 50th birthday you're going to drop dead, I'd be like, yep, sweet. That's not. I'm not actually terrified of the idea of not being here. Maybe slightly, but not in a crippling way. Or, but yeah, the idea of drifting away over between the ages of say 50 and 70, that's the thing that I'm actually quite would scare me or terrify me.
Thanks, Lech. Rachel and Ross, just based on what Lech was saying there, made me think of numerous themes in your book around when you were talking about being a kid and trying to do the magical thinking of trying to keep your parents alive, and then, but then also Lech's exposure to. I know you've done a whole lot of psychology counselling, in front of people, Lech. It's in the book that Lech had counselling, and then you did it in front of psychology students.
Yeah, my sister was a psychologist, and so I didn't have any money at the time. I was 18, and she was like, well, I've got this professor who I'll ask him if he has any ideas. And so the professor came back and he said, yeah, I'm happy to do free therapy, provided that he he lets me film it and play it live to a room full of graduate psychological graduate students. And I was like, hell yeah! Like, as long as it's free, that's fine by me.
So typical uni student. So I just mentioned that because I'm going to ask Rachel and Ross to basically turn you into a case study very briefly, just very briefly, just to draw on the themes that, if you wanted to comment at all on the themes that Lech brought up, anything that struck you particularly.
Yeah, well, without knowing Lech, I wouldn't want to give too much commentary on his particular situation, particularly because his story, for those of you who have read it, is very, very complex. But some of the themes that Lech talks about in his book is this attempt to almost numb the pain that's come up from that experience. And that's something that we see a lot in the research, that often when people have had a confrontation with death, one of the most common ways people might try and cope with that is through trying to numb it through substances, through drinking, through anything that tries to push that pain away. And there are really strong relationships between existential issues in general, so often not just death on its own, but the feelings of meaninglessness and purposelessness that can come up after a near-death experience, where people have suddenly had it brought to the forefront how temporary and transient life is, and it raises all these other questions of what's the point in anything I'm doing. That substances and numbing and even kind of impulsive behaviours can be one of the really common ways people try and cope with it. Ernest Becker, who some of you might have read The Denial of Death, which was published in the 70s, and Becker won the Pulitzer Prize for this book. He was talking about this idea back then. He said modern man is drinking and drugging ourselves out of awareness, that attempt to really numb the pain is one of the ways people can cope with that fear. So that's what I think stood out to me from reading Lech's fantastic book.
I think another thing that Lech was in just describing your life, Lech, another thing that was really interesting is the way you've had these continuing bonds to the dead, to your parents. One of the things we write about in Mortals is that generally in Western cultures we don't do this very well. We don't have continuing relationships with the dead, whereas in some Eastern cultures they do that far more effectively. We tend to see death as happening in a moment and we bury the dead and the matter's done. Whereas the way you described sort of honouring your folks in the way you work and the things you now talk about and do, and that it's a reflection of both mum and dad, I think is really interesting, and one of the positive ways that humans deal with death. The other obvious thing is the production of the book itself. Another thing we write about is that creative pursuits, when a human creates something, whether it's a book or a painting or a song, you get to exist beyond the self. You now exist outside of the self, and that's another way in which humans deal with death and always have, leaving a mark. We've been doing this, in fact, before our species began. The handprints in the Spanish caves that we thought were early man turn out to be 2 or 3 species before us. They existed before Homo sapiens had even reached Europe. But this deep desire to leave a mark and say, I was here and I was real. And in Lech's case, I've produced this book and I've written these sentences and no one's ever put these sentences together before. This is an original construction of words, never to be repeated, is another way in which humans deal with this. So there's many, many things, I think.
Thanks. Thank you, Ross and Rachel. I feel like I just got a little bit of free psychological therapy there too, and so did all of you. But my book, The Eulogy, it's autofiction, but it's based on my sister who was dying for most of our lives from degenerative cancer, and I wrote this book, and now I kind of understand why I wrote the book, so thank you. Now, I guess one of the other things that, there's a lot that strikes me in Lech's book, which is an excellent read, dark but good, like us. So one of the things that struck me was the actions of you, the young protagonist in your story, doing the impulsive actions that could have actually led to your own death. So I was just wondering if you, Lech, and then you guys as well, want to comment on at all about that death wish that can haunt a survivor.
Yeah, it was something like, because I got about a year after the accident, I had been probably, in hindsight, probably depressed for about 6 months, and I'd had a creeping sense of suicidal ideation, and the reality of what had happened to me had sunk in, or was starting to sink in, and so my best mate Tim was still in hospital with a permanent brain injury, and so it was a pretty bleak period, and about a month after the 1 year anniversary, I got arrested for drink driving, which is obviously the last thing that a high profile survivor of a car accident should be getting done for, whether it was public or not. Like, it's just the ethical and moral decision to do that was, obviously a disgraceful one, and it was reported on, and I got arrested, and it was obviously rock bottom, and weirdly allowed me to probably start to actually heal from what had happened, because I now had like a legal imperative to get psychological help, which I probably never would have committed to if a judge hadn't have said you have to do this for a certain period of time. But yeah, what was the...
The question is about the kind of
death
wish.
And the death wish, that's... When I first started seeing, I think it was actually the GP, and I was quite a precocious kid, and my sister was a psychologist, so I'd done all this reading, and I went into this GP and said, this is an example of my death drive, and I was quoting Freud and saying all this stuff. And my GP was just listening to me with irritation. He was just like, no, I think that you just you were trying to be a man, and you probably climbed into the car for the same reason that you climbed into the car a year ago, because you haven't resolved the tensions between your masculinity, and you got shit faced. And so I'm not completely dismissing the importance of the sort of psychological analysis that we do on these situations, but I think that I was maybe looking for an excuse for why I'd done this, as if it was some really complex thing, rather than because I wasn't really taking responsibility for my health, or my mental health, or my physical health, and because I'd grown up in an environment where drink driving was socially acceptable. In fact, it was actually valorised by the people around me. It wasn't. It probably wasn't just the fact that I'd been in a car accident. It's possibly just something that I would have done whether I'd been in a car accident or not. But I think I was probably looking for a loophole to say, this is why I drunk drove. And the GP was sort of really good, because he was just like, no, I think it's a lot. It's probably more simple than that, and you need to take just responsibility for your own actions.
Yeah, thanks, Lech. And I just want to make a little footnote that the car crash, which is described in Lech's book, was not caused by drink driving. It was just an accident, really. But just as a little footnote, because that kind of comes up a bit in the media.
Yeah, the driver was sober and under the speed limit, so it was an accident. Sorry, I probably should have highlighted that at the beginning.
That's a really interesting point. And do you guys want to comment on what is interesting to me, and what Lech was talking about, is that proving your masculinity stuff? And is something in that to do with the fear of death, or is this? I'm sure there's lots of complexities, but over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Remember we said earlier that terror management theory says that you'll do what your culture says you should do, because if you're a good example of your culture, if you're a good example of a young man, for instance, you'd be remembered as a good example of a young man. Now, our culture, Lech's made the point that drink driving was something that was ticked where he grew up, and a lot of the messages given to young males as they grow up are really problematic, and then they echo those behaviours in their real life. If you think of models for men, probably the biggest screen model for man over the last 50 to 60 years has been James Bond. That would be probably the quintessential man's man. Bond is heavy drinking. I watched Spectre the other night, and he was having a medical, and the question was, how much do you drink? And Bond said to the young female interviewing him, too much. And, you know, we're meant to all laugh. Bond famously drives his car ridiculously. I mean, Bond should have been killed 20 times on the road. He's killed many people on the road, and really should have died many times on the road. So the messages we give young males, particularly growing up, is that this sort of hit-it-hard lifestyle is very much what a man is supposed to be, and we keep doing it. We keep sending those messages. That's not just a 1963 Bond, that's a 2020 Bond doing exactly the same stuff. So yeah, becoming who we're meant to be within our culture is certainly a big part of it.
And just to add on to that as well, that we see this in the laboratory as well. So we see experiments where, we cover this in the book, where young men, you'd have a group of young men, half of them are given a really subtle reminder of death, so 2 brief questions about death buried in a packet of 100 other questions, and the other half get all of the same questions but without those 2 reminders of death. And then they sit down at a driving simulator and they're just asked to drive as they would in a real car. And when young men are reminded of death, they actually drive much more quickly on this driving simulator than the young men who haven't been reminded of death. And you only find this with men because we don't have cultural messages for women saying, if you drive really quickly, you're going to be really cool. This is sort of specifically targeted for men. So we see this experimentally, this finding that reminders of death seem to drive young men to echo that cultural expectation of this is what young men do. This is how you live up to the standard of being a young man.
And there's some great stuff in your book about those various advertising campaigns that, so showing car crashes and people dying is not actually an effective deterrent, but showing social shaming seems to be more of a deterrent to high-risk driving, and it's really interesting. And that does bring me to another question, which is about gendered differences in terms of the work that you do, in terms of the fear of death and behaviours around that. And like, I'll just so you know, I'm going to ask you similar sort of question, but about the girls in your sort of friendship group and the different responses that you saw between you guys and them. Yeah.
So we do see generally women tend to score higher on measures of fears of death. Women tend to also score higher on measures of anxiety generally, but it's hard to know how much of this is that women are actually more anxious about death versus it's more considered more normal and acceptable for women to report openly being anxious, whereas obviously for men that's less encouraged and normalised. And interestingly, it's women that, despite on these questionnaires, they'll say they're more anxious. When you look at movements like the death positive movement, where there's been a big push in the last decade for people to normalise death, break down taboos, things like death cafes, for those of you who have heard of those, that's all really being led by women. The funeral industry is predominantly led by women. So it seems to be women who are actually mostly working in the field of death, obviously more female nurses, more women in palliative care. So there's this sort of contrast between, on the one hand, on questionnaires, women seem to be more fearful of death, but when you actually look at the real world, it's women who are really driving this push to talk about death and normalise it.
Lech, over to you. So did you see, looking back, can you recall sort of different responses to the deaths of your friends amongst your friendship group when it came to men and women, or boys and girls, I guess you were then?
Yeah, it was definitely noticeable that the girls were able to more openly grieve because there wasn't a social expectation to not show emotion. And so that was something that I certainly felt, because I was the youngest child in a big family in country Queensland. I grew up in a pub. Dad came from a very working class background. I was surrounded by rugby league players and tradies and pretty tough sort of people, and I internalised a lot of that, even though I was a pretty shithouse athlete, and I wasn't particularly physically blokey or masculine at all, but weirdly that actually meant that I overcompensated for that lack of physicality with being very boisterous, risk-taking male. And then after the accident happened, it was really noticeable because I remember talking to a friend and asking him what he remembered about me in that initial period, and he said that he remembered the next morning after the accident. I arrived at the hospital and I found out that I'd found out the night before that Will had died on impact. I found out that morning as I arrived that Hamish had died overnight, and he said he hugged me, and I just didn't reciprocate any affection towards him at all. And it wasn't just like because I was physically numb from the accident. It was like I was actually quite embarrassed that this guy would hug me in front of this group of girls. Like I was like, yeah, I was very uncomfortable with that. And so that wasn't something that I wasn't born with that. I remember being a really physically affectionate, quite over-emotional child. And then I remember rocking up to St Mary's in Toowoomba, which is a very tough all-boys rugby league school. Jonathan Thurston played there. He was in the first footy team with my brother Stephen, and so I'd grown up watching all these guys. And then over the period up until the accident, I'd like continually taught myself how to contain my emotions, because I went for like I remember in primary school crying in class, which was just the most disgraceful thing that you could ever do. And so for the next until grade 12, I just like repressed any display of emotion until the point where the accident happened. It was like I'd spent the last since I was 10 learning how to mask any sign of emotion, and then this event happened which required me to express emotion in order to process what had actually happened, and I just couldn't display anything. Like I didn't cry at any of the funerals. I don't think I cried publicly until about 6 months after the accident, and that was as other people had stopped showing any emotion. So it was actually quite alienating experience. And so yeah, it just goes to show the way that it goes back to the whole point about the lessons that we teach men, and yeah, I'd certainly internalised all of that, and I remember when I was showing all this stoicism during that whole funeral process, the amount of people who congratulated me on how stoic I was being, and like in a really well-meaning way, but yeah, there was lots of like pats on the back, and I really fed off that, and I thought, and not just from like a toxic masculinity point of view or whatever, like I also thought that was just a good thing to do, because all these people who had lost kids, and I didn't want to be a burden on anyone else, and I thought that I could be a source of strength rather than a source of like anxiety. And so I really leaned into this numbness that I was feeling and tried to embrace other people around me and minimise any grief that I felt, which was ridiculous because obviously I just lost 3 friends. So at some point I needed to actually connect with that reality.
Yeah, thanks, Lech. Yeah, and it's a total misreading of the Stoics, I think, as well. But we do that. We think it's good to be, So when working with funerals, I always say to dads or brothers or sons that the bravest thing that they could do and the best thing they could do for everybody at the funeral is get up at that lectern and cry, if that's what comes up. Because they want to be able to say something, but they don't want to break down. It's like, well, you're at a funeral. Like, if you can't break down at a funeral, where can you break down? But like you say, Lech, it's pretty deeply buried. You can't just, switch it on and off. Yeah. Do you feel like writing the book helped you sort of deconstruct some of that and get back at little emotional Lech?
Yeah, a little bit in terms of the narrative. Like, people always ask, was it therapeutic to write the book? And I'm like, oh, not really, because it was just hard work, and like it was like therapy is therapy, and I didn't see the book as being me. My priority with the book was always like a literary priority. It wasn't to memorialise the dead. It wasn't to sort of like process my own stuff. I see those as separate to the act of actually writing. Although there are unintended examples where you do start, like even towards the end of the book as I was writing, where I was like, oh shit, like I never quite understood myself in quite the same way, because I've reconstructed these scenes with, say, my dad, and it's not until you really crystallise that you go, oh, like I can picture this all so perfectly, and I can feel what I was feeling in those moments, and yeah, you do have like little light bulb moments.
Thanks, Lech. So we do have time for questions from everybody here. So if you, I've already got a couple, all right. Because I was going to say, I've got a couple more, but all right, we'll go to you. I think we've got a roving mic, yep. So the woman in the...
Do you think churches have a lot to answer for? I grew up in the generation where it was all hellfire and brimstone. I never went to a funeral till I was in my 30s, and my mother never went to one till in her 90s, and I'm sure that has an effect on people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we would both work with people who the fear of hellfire and brimstone is, in some cases, the entire reason that they're fearing death, that they're okay with the idea of non-existence, but it's the idea that there's some kind of eternal punishment that awaits them after death. And I think the church then has a lot to answer for because of that.
Yeah, I just echo that clinically, we're both, in addition to being academics, clinical psychologists. We deal with a lot of people with very severe anxiety, obsessive compulsive problems, and certainly we see a lot of people who are constantly judging the self. We see a lot of people that are living in constant fear that even the thoughts they're having in their head could lead to damnation. Just the mere presence of a thought or image could somehow lead to a judgment against me, and they'll be neutralising their thoughts 10 hours a day or 12 hours a day. It's a terrible thing to watch. So, there are certain beliefs that have been promulgated by some churches that clearly hurt a lot of humans. A woman I saw, I haven't thought of this person in many a year. I probably saw her 25 years ago. She said she went to confession. I saw her in her 70s. She was about 75 when she came to see me. She said that for her entire life, she was about 17 when she'd gone to confession, and she confessed that she had an image that had come into her head, a sexual image involving Christ. And the priest had said, well, you better get rid of that or you'll burn in hell. Now, what research has shown about thought suppression is if you try and block an image, you get more of it. She'd spent from 17 to 70, she said, 24/7 with images of this type in her head. She hadn't been able to work. She hadn't been able to marry. She was in constant despair of the images she had in her head, and she was finally coming in for treatment. And one of the saddest things I think I've seen clinically was her recovery, because she did recover reasonably quickly with modern treatment, but then realised she'd spent her entire life with this fate. I'll stop at that point, or I'll get on a roll about some of the action of some of the churches.
Thanks, Ross. This young woman with the black hair, and then.
So, I guess my question is, how do you make the differentiation between humanity's fear of death and their fear of suffering, or fear of the pain of life? And take, for example, that the example of your experiment with the young boys and the driving simulation, and the ones that had mention of death drove faster. And arguably what I immediately thought when I heard that was that death, rather than it being something that is feared, it's an irresistible lure to these young men, because it means an end to the suffering of life, and it's a suffering that our boys haven't been equipped with emotionally to manage.
Yeah, I'm happy to take it. I think it's a really interesting question. We have a chapter on suicide. Camus, the French existentialist, said that suicide is the only serious philosophic question that's left for humans. Why aren't we all taking it? Because the pain of life is extremely difficult, and if I'm living on a rock hurtling through space at 100,000 kilometres an hour and there's no other meaning than that, and I suffer and toil across my life, should I just step off? Which I think speaks to your issue. Are we drawn towards it? Now, the existentialist went on to argue that would be a foolish action, and that in the time we have of a life, we can learn to live at large and enjoy our existence and as I said before, move the skeleton to the right places while you can. But I agree, there's a tremendous amount of pain in living, and humans are often drawn to death because of the pain of living. There's no doubt about that.
So would you think those terms are interchangeable, that fear of death or fear of life?
No, I think I think the example of the fast driving, and there's other examples like smoking and sun tanning, and still come down to people trying to be a great example of who they were meant to be in a life. The models have shown them that the fast driving and the drinking and the smoking and this is the way I live and this is how I'll be remembered and that's a good thing. I don't think they're trying to kill themselves through those actions at all. I remember another memory that's come back to me today that I haven't thought of for a long time. When I was about 17, I was driving, and the story goes that I heard from a girlfriend's mother. She said, I was at a friend's place the other day, and we heard this car zooming around a corner and clipped the curb at a very fast speed coming up the road. And then we all laughed because we saw it was you, Ross. And I remember being proud. I remember being pleased that this group of people had seen me take that corner, on the edge. I mean, how ridiculous is that? I'd actually hit the gutter. You wouldn't, not a fine example of driving, but you'd think I'd be embarrassed that I hadn't managed to stay on the road in a suburban street. But I liked it because it fitted with, the image of what the young male is meant to be. Yeah. So I don't think they're being drawn to death in any of that. I think they're being drawn to living a life that defies it.
I know we're living in a postmodern era, but I'd like to go back to the other comment about the world's religions, and it doesn't necessarily have to be negative. I mean, the upside is that there's always been this traditional belief in human immortality post-death, and I'd just like to discuss that whole concept. Why have people from various different religious backgrounds, always since the Egyptian times, for example, always had this concept of post-mortal immortality?
So I think it's a really good point, and we cover this a lot in the book, that every religion that we know of offers some kind of solution to the problem of death, usually through some kind of immortal soul. And the religions that offered better versions of that lasted longer. So there's a reason why, most people in Australia would be Christian and wouldn't be following Norse mythology, because when Christianity came along, it offered a version of the afterlife, which was you were physically brought back in the afterlife. The Greeks and Romans didn't have that. In Greece and Rome, there was a shadowy soul version of yourself that lived in Hades, but it wasn't a very pleasant place, so you were immortal, but you just hung around in a dark cave for most of the time. And then along came Christianity, which said, no, you're actually physically brought back in heaven. It's a pleasant place. And so none of us really now believe in Zeus or Jupiter. The very different religions have stuck around that have offered more appealing versions of the afterlife. And clearly religion has a lot of benefits to people, so connectedness, a sense of community, a sense of purpose, and we're not trying to challenge or change anyone's religious belief. But interestingly, when you look at what types of death acceptance are associated with better well-being, so there are 3 types of death acceptance. One is escape acceptance. So I accept death because I see it as an escape from my present pain and suffering. There's also approach acceptance. So I accept death because I view it as a gateway to a better life. So an afterlife, I'll be reunited with loved ones. And then there's neutral acceptance, which is I accept death because it's natural, it's inevitable, it's neither good nor bad. All three types of death acceptance are associated with better outcomes than non-acceptance. But interestingly, it's neutral acceptance of death as neither good nor bad, as natural and inevitable, that is associated with better coping, better well-being, less distress, less anxiety than even approach acceptance, which is believing in the afterlife. So clearly those kinds of afterlife beliefs offer some comfort to many people, but interestingly it seems like just accepting death the way that the Stoics did, as something that we can't escape, something that is neither good nor bad, seems to actually be associated with better happiness and contentment than accepting it purely as a gateway to an afterlife.
So we've got this fellow up the back and the woman with the red top and then you.
Thank you for your interesting ideas. I've got two questions. One, you suggested that we surround ourselves with the memorabilia of skeletons and skulls and death. Are there any personality types or periods that we might go through in our lives when surrounding ourselves with such things might push us into depression or deepen our depression? My second question is it helpful or not for people to know exactly when they're going to die?
Well, the first question, is there a point of life where reminders of death or really facing death is a bad plan, is a really interesting question. The most obvious thing that people sometimes think is that young children might not do well with this, and certainly people struggle to explain death to young children, and often the denials of death begin in the very young. Rachel sometimes tells the story in these talks that when we were, and I have to admit that I did do this, when we were young, when she was young and travelling, if we'd see a dead animal on the road, and Rach might have been 3 and would say, "Is that a dead animal?" I'd say, "No, it's a stuffed toy, darling. Someone's thrown a stuffed toy out." And she'd go, "Okay, that's fine then." So a really interesting example of just denial. I just didn't want to say, "Yes, that poor animal was hit by a car and now it's dead, and it was alive before, and its family are on the other side of the road." You know, I just didn't want to get into it. So. But interestingly, the research says the opposite, that as children are acquiring their understanding of death between 3 and 10, that it's actually better to be really frank and direct about death, and that bodily processes stop and the dead can't hear you, and all of those very direct messages. So even children do better psychologically if they're not avoiding death. So no, I don't think there's a point in life not to talk about death. Interestingly, the natural history of it is that fear of death rises in youth, levels off in the midlife, and actually improves in post about 60. Fear of death starts to soften. Now that could be for a few obvious reasons. One is you've lived potentially a fulsome life and you're happy with the way you lived. A lot of the people we see clinically that are, say, in their 20s are terrified that if I get taken out of the game now, I got robbed. You know, I got robbed when the stuff was about to get good. And so they're doing everything to prevent death. So there's no problem talking about death later in life. Already the fear of death is dropping off. There's no problem talking about death early in life. Children cope better than we think.
It's probably, though, maybe like not too many skulls and skeletons, though, in any particular...
My office is a little over the top for skulls and skeletons.
Exclusively talking about death.
You don't need a coffin necessarily as your desk or your dining table.
I know you had another question, but I am going to move on just so we can get to you and you before our time is up, and you can bail Ross up at the signing table.
Yeah, I heard you say that the immortality that often comes with religions, that life after death, talked a bit about it as ultimate denial, and the alternative to that is living large or bearing children. Double-barrel question, I guess. When we see post-spiritual cultures, Europe becoming less Christian, China becoming more secular, we often see the birth rate go down. I'm not clinical, I can't say, by research or anything. Is there some sort of link there? Have you ever seen any link there with more acceptance of death actually meaning less children? And I guess I was interested in the other thing that Lech said was, is there, when you fear death less, do you end up fearing suffering more or something like that? And so I guess those two elements of that, what are some of those results across a society of fearing death less?
So I think the issue of people having less children, I think, would have a lot of complicated factors that would play into that. Things like women being more involved in the workforce, better education, better access to contraception. So I think there's probably I wouldn't want to say that's specifically linked with people's increased acceptance of death, for instance. But we do know from the research that if you think back to what we were saying earlier about those subtle reminders of death and how they impact people's behaviour, they've done similar studies all around the world showing that when you give people subtle reminders of death, they want to have more children. So if you give people a subtle reminder of death and then ask them, how many more children would you like? On average, they'll want one more child than they would have said if you hadn't have reminded them of death. So clearly a big part of the motivation to have children is to extend the self through passing on your DNA. So I think that's definitely one thing that's playing a role. And I've forgotten the other half of your question, so.
That's okay. You might have to bail Rachel up at the signing table because I'm getting the wrap-up signal. I'm sorry we didn't get to you, but again, these guys will all be at the signing table after this. So if you can all just join with me in thanking our guests today.